Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to UAI's campus in Vitacura, and good morning to everyone who's watching on Zoom, or we are live transmitting this. This event will be recorded, and it's going to be available on our website for those of you who want to see and watch these later. It is a pleasure to have you here, Kate. Kate, as you probably know, is the managing partner and co-leader of the biotech franchise at SV Health Investors, with offices in London and Boston, correct, where we both studied a long time ago.
Me longer than you.
No. In her 30 years there, Kate's biotech investments have resulted in the launch of 8 drugs to treat complicated diseases, including cancer. In May 2020, while she was working, as many of us, in lockdown, in your case, in your cottage in Wales, Kate got a call from then Health Secretary of the UK, Matt Hancock. The news was Prime Minister Johnson, Boris Johnson, wanted Kate to chair the Vaccine Taskforce of the UK to make sure they supply vaccines to the UK populations, but also to the broader world's population. Her initial reaction was to reject the job. Is that true?
Well, I was gobsmacked, so I wasn't.
I've heard that Kate believed at the time that a successful COVID-19 vaccine was, quote, the longest of the long shots.
Correct.
That is, by the way, the long shot, the title of the book she wrote, yeah, telling this story. But her daughter convinced her to take the job.
Correct.
I mean, how did that happen?
Because, I mean, if you're all doing a job and somebody calls you to say, will you do a different job?
And you love your job.
Your first reaction is, but I've got a job already.
Yeah.
So that was my first reaction. My second reaction was, I don't know, I'm not a vaccine expert because I've never invested in vaccines. And then I kept coming up with all these reasons. And then Matt said to me, none of us have ever done this before. We're asking you to help. So then I said, okay, give me some time. And then I put the phone down, and my daughter said, so what, because I was sort of screaming at this point.
How old is her?
She is now 24, so she was 22, and she was doing final exams. And she then said to me, why couldn't I do it? And so I gave her all the reasons why I couldn't. And of course, as a mother, I'd always been telling her that she had to go off and put herself out there and aim for things that even if she didn't think she could do them. So she then basically gave it all back to me and said, you should do it.
A lot of people are thankful to her for that little nudge. Even though it was a long shot, Kate and her team hit the target in spite of the distance of the shot. But she's going to tell that story later. I will only say that in 2021, Kate was awarded a DBE in the Queen's Birthday Honors for her services, and that many lives were saved as a consequence of her job. Outside of SV, Kate serves on the board of the Biomedical Institute Francis Crick. At weekends, I've heard she spends time in Wales, where she rides horses. You rode horses a couple of days ago.
I did, down in
Torres del Paine.
Yeah.
And he bought snorkels. What does that mean? I checked that at Google because I didn't know what that was, and the videos didn't look very exciting to me.
No, so it was a way for a local village in Wales to raise money because it's very boggy and wet.
Boggy is pantanos, right?
So they dig a trench in the bog and it all fills up with water. And then they have competitions for people to swim through it or bike through it with a face mask and
muddy water. Anyway, her academic credentials include a title in biochemistry from Oxford University and an MBA from the Harvard Business School, where she was a Baker Scholar. That was very hard to do. Kate,
I bet you were a Baker Scholar.
Huh?
I bet you were a Baker Scholar.
I was not. I was good at partying, though. Kate will start with the presentation, and then we will open up for Q&A. I might ask the first 2 questions, and then I'm going to open it up for you guys to ask her questions. So, Kate, it is a great honor to have you here. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I know I speak very quickly, so just wave if I'm speaking too quickly and I'll try and slow down. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about venture capital to begin with and my background before I got into vaccines, to explain the perspective that I brought to the Vaccine Taskforce. And then I'll tell you the story about vaccines. And actually, if you want to ask questions as we go along, that's fine too. So compliance. So what I do is I'm a biotech venture capitalist. So I turn breaking new science that potentially can be used to develop new drugs. So understanding the biological pathways of disease so that you can slow or stop diseases. So that's my job. And that's what I've been doing for 30 years. So I don't know anything else, but I do this.
And sorry that I interrupt. I read that you knew you wanted to do this from the very beginning.
That's generous.
Okay.
When you apply to business school, you have to write essays about why you want to go to business school. And I didn't really have any particular reason, except that the firm I was working for had been set up by a Harvard Business School professor. So there was a very strong reason, and everybody was pushed to go to Harvard. So I had to come up with a reason. So my reason then was, well, I was going to link my biochemistry background with business. And actually, the more I got into it, I thought it was a great idea. Okay. But it was originally triggered because of the business school application process.
Okay. That's good to know.
So, just in terms of what we do here is I manage, or our team manages a series of venture capital funds. So we start at very early drug discovery, so company creation. So where you've got some really interesting science, maybe a new pathway that causes cancer or rheumatoid arthritis or asthma. So where you've got some really interesting new science, we will then set up the companies, we'll bring together management, we'll put together the business plan. We actually have incubation space in our own offices to start doing that very early company creation. So we've got funds that do that, including a dedicated fund for dementia, which again is very specialist and about as high risk as you can get. So we have really true venture capital funds. More recently, we've raised funds that do crossover. So the sort of last financing before a company goes public. And then we have a fund that invests in public companies. So in our business, we're not building companies for revenues at this stage. At the early stages, the assets that we create are patents and data. So whether it's clinical data or preclinical data, it's the data package plus the patents that we sell. So my companies are loss-making R&D businesses that have the potential to develop blockbuster drugs. But it's likely that the companies that will actually launch the drugs will be the big pharmaceutical companies. So we do the innovative stuff and they do the late stage registration. So that's what I've been doing for a very long time. And as you will know, in venture capital, it's a very merit-driven business. So you won't raise another fund unless you return money to your investors. So the investors, because they give us money for 10 years, because these are 10-year funds, except, and I'm sure as you're teaching in the course, venture capital funds never last for 10 years. They always take longer. Right. So that when an investor gives you money for 10 years, they're probably giving you money for 13 or 14 years, and you can't really get it out. So they only will give you the money if you do a good job. So we've been able to raise money, so our returns have been good. And this is just, it gives you a flavor of the breadth of what we invest in. So we look at all the different clinical areas. So oncology or cancer is a core focus for us, as it is across the industry. But we'll also look at inflammation, neuroscience. And what's interesting is there are lots and lots of new ways of developing drugs. So if we talked, say, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, most drugs are little white pills that you take, oral pills that you take in from a packet. Now, you get antibodies, which are injections, or antibodies with drugs attached to them, or gene therapy, cell therapy, where you manipulate cells and put them back to enhance an immune response. So now the range of different drugs that we develop is huge. And yeah, so it's not related now. So we used to use Schroders. Schroders set us up originally. Yes, it just never. The two businesses never really worked. So we used to pay Schroders for the name. They would be the general partner. We paid them a cut of fees and carried interest. And then in 2000, all ties were cut. So that's why we went from Schroder Ventures to SV, which is not very creative. So that's my background. But as you can see, none of that included vaccines. The team, as you might imagine, is full of, with the exception of me, people with really deep clinical or scientific backgrounds who develop drugs, discover drugs, and then we've got people with a lot of degrees that then help us. Importantly, these are the venture partners are the people that actually help leverage our investing team. So these are all people who are either fundamental drug discovery scientists, company managers, they help us with due diligence, they help us recruit people, they sit on the boards, they do everything. So this is our ability to create new companies, and that's been very successful. And then you were kind enough to mention the drugs. So of course we are venture capitalists, so we are, our goal is to deliver outsized returns to investors, but we do so by developing new drugs. And so these are all the drugs that we have helped discover over the 30 years that we've been doing this. And what you can see on the left-hand side, these tend to be symptomatic drugs. So drugs that just change the symptoms of a disease, but don't alter the underlying course of a disease. And as you go to the right-hand side, they start to change the ultimate course of disease. So Lynparza, for example, now is a treatment for a certain kind of ovarian cancer for women with a particular genetic background. And that is now, I wouldn't say it's curative yet, but over 2/3 of patients are still alive at 5 years versus a very small fraction historically. So we've got really good changes. And importantly, the little green dots are the new drug categories. So that's where we've invented drugs for the first time to treat a disease, which then other companies can come in and develop improved drugs. So from a patient's perspective, they now have a breadth of diseases, of choices of drugs. So I don't know if any of you know macular degeneration, where you get injections in the back of your eye. So we developed the first of those drugs, and now that's a $10, $15 billion industry. So we get a nice return, but patients ultimately will get a choice of drugs. So that's the background to me on venture. I'm now going to take you to March 2020. And as in Chile, in the UK, the press were all over. This is a massive crisis, and the whole country has to go into lockdown. And we all have to work at home, and this is what we did. And of course, we had Boris Johnson, who was always very flamboyant. So as you mentioned, well, first of all, our chief scientific advisor is a guy, Patrick Vallance, and he used to be head of research and development at GSK, so one of the major pharmaceutical companies, which is the first or second vaccine company in the world. So he understood vaccines, and in March started creating an expert group to advise the government on vaccine procurement and development and manufacturing. And that started off being an advisory group. So I started off actually as an advisor to the government because of my background in the small companies. So again, most innovation comes from small companies. So I was originally brought onto that committee, and it was quite clear that that was inadequate because an advisory group meeting once every week or every other week for 1 hour doesn't achieve anything. So I then get a phone call from the health secretary saying, we want you to chair a vaccine task force. And everything in government is done by text. So all phone calls are preceded with a text saying, can you speak? So eventually I get a call from the Prime Minister saying, I want you to do this. And what was interesting is that Boris emphasized speed. So the whole focus for him was to do it as quickly as possible, because every day people were going to be dying. And so he gave me 3 goals. The first goal was to secure access to vaccines for the UK. The second goal was to secure vaccines for distribution around the world so that everybody who was at risk could get vaccines. And the third was to help develop a plan for long-term pandemic preparedness in the UK. So what I reminded him of was that it was highly likely to fail. Not that we shouldn't do it, but the chances that this would work was going to be pretty small. So to begin with, if you remember, we had coronavirus pandemics before. There was SARS and there was MERS, and people had tried to develop vaccines against SARS and MERS and had failed. So that was the first thing. It had never been done. The second thing is we had no idea about this virus. We didn't really know anything about how it had infected, how quickly it mutated, or any of that. So that was unknown. The most advanced vaccine formats, so the vaccines that you guys will all have had, so the mRNA vaccines and the adeno, so Moderna and Pfizer, and the adeno vaccines, which the AZ and Janssen, they had never been approved for any product ever. So that we didn't know, again, anything about these actual types of vaccines, even though they were the most advanced candidates. And then I put this chart in. The quickest time for any vaccine to ever be developed before was mumps. And that was about 4 years. And that was 50 years ago, when the regulatory requirements were much less stringent than they are now. So all these reasons were strong arguments as to why getting vaccines quickly was not likely to happen. But I explained to the Prime Minister and said, you have to do it, and you're going to have to invest money now, even if the chances are that most of these things would fail. And that was the bit that only really 2 leaders around the world did a good job, which was Donald Trump in America and Boris. So they invested very heavily, very, very early in the research and development, manufacturing and scale up of vaccines, realizing that they might lose their money. So that was the background. And so, of course, as a venture capitalist, the way I approached this was through a venture capital lens, because that's how I see everything. And so the sort of, and in the course of my 30 years, yes, we've had 20 drugs that have been approved, but we've had multiples of that have failed. So that I'm used to dealing with uncertainty and incomplete information. So the 3 key principles that I applied to the vaccine task force were basically the same as I applied normally to my venture deals. So the first is to bring a team together that really knows what they're doing, who are experts. I'm not an expert, but I'm good at bringing teams together. And they need to be well networked into industry, because we've got to have those skills immediately. And then the second thing is we've got to be able to work very, very quickly and to address the goals that were set. And thirdly, we had to sort out and manage the risk, given that mostly this was likely to fail. And so those were the key sort of venture lessons. And so how we did this was, first of all, to bring that team together. And so I brought in people with whom I'd worked before, who brought the manufacturing and scale up, the scientific, clinical development skills, as well as those industry skills, into a steering group. And that's basically the people on the left of the chart. And then the people on the right, and so Nick, who's in the middle, he was he's called a director general, but he's the person, the most senior person in government that basically makes sure that everything we recommend is legal and is done in the process that works for the government. So he started his life as a bomb disposal engineer, so very calm, under, used to stress. And he basically then built the rest of the civil service team. So commercial negotiation and procurement, program management, diplomacy, because we were obviously working with other countries. And that was the team we had. We never met physically. We met, did everything on Zoom on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 8 o'clock in the morning for 2 hours. And everybody had a very clear task, and we had very clear goals. And of course, because we knew very little at the beginning, we tried to put a structure in place so that we could, when we had information, we could then fit that in to the structures. And our role was basically advisory. So we would assess all the different vaccine candidates and look at all the things that we needed to put in place for manufacturing and clinical development. And we would then make recommendations, but the actual spending decisions were taken by the ministers. So these were the secretaries of state, the most senior ministers. We would make business proposals too, which were not what I would regard as a business plan, but because they were far too long and repetitive. But we would prepare those proposals, and the ministers then took the decisions. So we didn't change the way that government works. We just compressed it. So when I took the job, I insisted on lots of conditions. One was I could recruit my own people. The second was that we would have swift decision-making. Third was that we would have a ring-fenced budget. So we didn't argue the whole time about whose budget would it come out of. And the government agreed to all of that. And that worked incredibly well. So this was the team that, and I still have not met everybody.
Still have not met?
No.
Okay.
So there's one guy here I've not met, the diplomat guy. So because we did it all by video. So that was the team, and it was incredibly effective. And it was by bringing in the private sector experts who had the relationships with government and with a very clear set of goals.
Kate, you were working at an arm. You were not paid for your job.
No.
Everybody else?
Oh, we're being paid, yeah.
Okay.
But I was also married to a MP, so a member of parliament. So it would have just been very awkward.
Yeah, I know.
To get paid.
Okay.
And also, I agreed to do 6 months, so it wasn't very long.
Yeah, but you got flexibility to hire. I
could hire
private
sector I wanted.
Guys.
There was one person we hired who, even though GSK is a big vaccine company, all their people are based on the continent in Europe. So we needed a clinician who was used to running clinical trials for industry. So there's two types of clinical trials. There are clinical trials that are run by academics in order to get a paper in Nature or New England Journal of Medicine. And there are clinical trials run by companies in order to get a drug approved. And they're quite different because the industrial clinical trials are much, much more focused on what does a regulator want and just get that data and nothing else. So I said, we need somebody like that in our team. And we couldn't find anybody in the UK. And so eventually I called my friend from GSK Vaccines, who's Italian, and said, can you help me find somebody? And he said, yes. My friend who's just left GSK Vaccines is a consultant, so you should call him. He's an Italian based in Rome. So I called him in Rome and he said, yes, he would work with us. But the British government process took 6 months to work out how to pay him.
Really?
So he worked for us full time for 6 months without a contract, we promised him that we would pay him, but it took 6 months. He was paid in December.
Wow.
It's not good. So that's the team. So then the next sort of theme of how do we get everybody aligned and how do we get quick decisions as we would do in venture capital. And as you've got new data, we need to be able to pivot and we need to be able to focus quickly. So the first question we asked of the experts was, who did they want to vaccinate? Because our job was not to determine the vaccination policy. That was for, in our case, we have a committee called JCVI, Joint Committee of Vaccinations and Immunizations, who are a group of vaccine experts who advise the government. And in our case, they said at that time, they just wanted to vaccinate the vulnerable. So that was all adults over the age of 50 and all adults under 50 with underlying diseases. So in the UK, that was 30 million people. Now, that's not very much compared with the European Union or the US. And so we had to then think, well, how can we get the vaccine companies to work with us when we're going to be a tiny customer? They're not going to make a lot of money from us. And so our approach was to be what we called the best possible client. So to do everything we possibly could do to help the vaccine companies get their vaccines manufactured, scaled up, developed, and approved. And that's why, again, we brought in those experts so that below those experts, we could then task the different teams with people who knew what they were doing. So we did that. We worked very closely with our regulator, which was important because nothing would work if the regulator wasn't going to make quick decisions, and they were incredibly good. As you probably know, in the UK, we have a national health service. So that means that everybody in the UK has an NHS number, which means we can get to everybody. And because of having a national healthcare delivery service, that could be brought and basically instructed to say, this is what you need to do. And we started that in July. So started planning how you're going to get we didn't know what it was we were going to vaccinate with, but we knew that we were going to need to have a very sophisticated deployment plan. And we started that early. So the things we did was two things. One was, how could we accelerate the clinical development? So normally it takes a long time to go through the regulatory process, but in our case, MHRA was very quick. So then the next slowest thing is actually getting people into clinical trials. So we set up a registry on the NHS website so that anybody sitting at home wondering what they could do to help could sign up on the registry and consent to be contacted about clinical trials. So that didn't mean they were enrolling in clinical trials, but they could be told about clinical trials. And we did that so that we could go to the vaccine companies and say, we've already got a group of volunteers who are potentially willing to take part in clinical trials now. But it was important for us to have people who were representative of vulnerable people. It was no good to have a group of 25-year-old fit young students. We needed to have people who were old and people with diseases. And we went out on local radio, writing in newspapers, doing everything we possibly could. And we ended up with over 500,000 people signed up, with over a third over the age of 60. So we ended up with an old group of volunteers, which meant that we were very quick. And when we went to the vaccine companies and said, we can help you recruit your clinical trials quickly, then they believed us, and then we did, and it worked. So that was probably the main thing we did to accelerate clinical development. And then the second thing we did, have I lost a...
There you go.
Yeah, okay. So then the next thing we did was to think about, sort of along the way, we scaled up manufacturing. We did a lot of work on manufacturing on existing sites. So we couldn't build anything from scratch. So we took the industry that was there, and that's why it was really important that we had those relationships. And basically supercharge them. So if they only had bioreactors of 200 litres, we bought them bioreactors of 1,000 litres. And we bought fill finish. So the first stage of manufacturing is to actually make the vaccine itself. The second stage is to put them in the vials. And we knew that the fill finish, the putting them in the vials, was going to be constrained. And so we bought 2 years worth of fill finish capacity. Again, we didn't know what we were going to put in it, but we knew we were going to need it. And again, it was another offer to the vaccine companies to say, you can ship us vaccine in bulk, even if you can't do the fill finish, because we'll do that for you. So we did a bunch of investments at risk in order to accelerate our ability to get scaled up vaccines as well as getting them approved. So we then had to build a portfolio because we didn't know which of any of the vaccines would work. And as I said, the leading vaccines, the mRNA and adeno vaccines, had never been approved. So they're basically sort of 3 types of vaccine. The first, the adeno and mRNA, is where you're just injecting the genetic material that encodes the spike protein, and the body's own cells then make the spike protein, either using the mRNA or using the virus that basically gets into the cell and then harnesses the cell's machinery to make spike protein. So that was completely unknown, but they were the most advanced vaccines. So we evaluated about 190 different vaccine types, vaccines that were being developed, and we narrowed down to what we thought were the best vaccines in each type of vaccine. So that was the Pfizer. Moderna we didn't think would be ready in time, and it proved not to be ready. It was ready in the US, but it wasn't ready anywhere else. And we did not believe that Moderna would ship their vaccine from the US to outside the US. So we deprioritized Moderna and we prioritized Pfizer. AZ and Janssen. AZ was ahead, but Janssen we thought was a better vaccine. And so we made 4 bets on those ones. Each
local facilities, or those were like based on imports?
So both is the answer. So Pfizer was based on imports coming from Belgium, but they had a manufacturing both in Europe and in the US. So the US, if you remember, had a very strong law called the US Defense Act, which meant that the White House could commandeer anything from a US company. And they tried to invoke that with us. And so in July, I got a call from both Pfizer and BioNTech. So BioNTech is the German company that actually owns the vaccine. And they said, the White House wants to sequester all the Pfizer vaccine. And they said, we've already agreed terms with you for number of doses, delivery, price. And they said, we will go back to the White House and tell them we will refuse to give them the vaccine if you can agree to binding indemnity legal language, by tomorrow. So I went back to the government and said, we need to have this binding language. And we'd been working on it for the last few weeks. So while it's a big ask for any government to be asked to give unlimited indemnities to a company, they'd quantified what they thought the cost could be. And so they were able to come up in 24 hours with binding language, and we got it agreed. So they went back to the White House and they said, we can't agree to this because we've already agreed with the UK. And then the White House backed off. But we thought we were safe because of having a separate European supply chain as well as US. But the fact that Pfizer and BioNTech were worried meant we were worried. But in any case, that worked. So Pfizer was European, AZ was onshore, Moderna would have been European, but it hadn't even started, and Janssen was European as well as US. So all of those, it was a key part of our prioritization, was that we believed that we would be able to get the vaccine, whether we manufactured it ourselves or in Europe, because there were plenty of good vaccines, but we didn't believe they could get manufactured in time.
Kate, for those of us who are not following, the vaccine space closely, in retrospect, you picked, the right ones out of 109.
No, they were. All of these have now been approved. But so we balanced the portfolio with the risky ones at the beginning, and then the bottom 2 categories are the standard sort of vaccine formats. So where you've actually either inject the protein itself to elicit an immune response, or you inject the dead virus itself. So you take the SARS-CoV-2 virus, kill it, and then that becomes the vaccine. So we balance the portfolio of the high risk, unknown vaccines with the low risk vaccines. And what was interesting is the number 1 and 2 vaccine companies in the world are GSK and Sanofi. So for me, that was the most likely vaccine to work. If I had to put my money on which one would get to the end, I would have put my money on that one. And that was the one that is only just being approved. So it was by far the worst vaccine of all of them. Yeah. And so basically, 18 months late compared with everybody else, or 2 years late.
Which confirms the portfolio approach.
Exactly.
Right? So.
You have to have the portfolio approach. And what was interesting was our focus was on speed. So we spent about a little over £10 a dose, depending on currency exchange, $12 US dollars, $13 US dollars a dose. So we weren't paying a lot of money. We did pay Pfizer more money for delivery of vaccines in 2020. So that was the only time when we gave a sort of financial incentive to get more vaccine. But other than that, we did not pay differently really from the US.
I think start with you for each country. These big players was US versus UK versus Israel in terms of pricing.
I don't think there was a lot of difference in pricing. Not really. I mean, because the US disclosed their pricing and they weren't hugely different. The way we built our contracts was it was upfront purchases to enable them to help scale up and do the manufacturing. And then generally we only paid them for when the vaccine was actually approved. So in some cases we put more money up front, like with AstraZeneca, we had to put a lot of money up front because they didn't have anything ready. With Pfizer, we put up less up front and then we paid the rest when the vaccines worked. So we did tranche the money so that we could minimize how much we would lose if the vaccines failed.
I guess behind Martin's question is the usual, practice in pharma, but not in COVID, that the same company may charge very different prices for the same vaccine or drug in different markets, which I don't think happened.
I don't think it happened among the Western, the high income countries. For the low income countries, the price was dramatically lower. But it was interesting. So if you look at these companies, the mRNA companies all charged market-based pricing. So their costs were way higher because they had real profits that they were seeking. Equally, Pfizer did not take any government money. So they funded everything themselves. Moderna took plenty of government money. AZ, Janssen, GSK, Sanofi, all sold their vaccines on a non-profit basis. So they were not seeking to make a profit. And so actually the AstraZeneca vaccine was the most widely used vaccine because it went to people that actually needed it as opposed to the people who could pay. So if you look again in 21, there was more AstraZeneca vaccine given around the world than there was the mRNA vaccines because mRNA generally went to those countries who were able to pay for it. So it wasn't equitable, actually, but at least the non-mRNA companies did have a very different pricing strategy. So that's what we did on the vaccines. And then this was I don't know if you guys ever looked in World in Data, but this is my favorite chart when after we'd been vaccinating for a week, we were the only country in the world to have actually got any, even a mark on the board on how many vaccines were being delivered. And then this is basically the sort of the punchline on how we approach the whole vaccine task force with the venture capital lens. So as a venture capitalist, you have to build a portfolio because things are going to fail. And it really is important to define in each company, what are the goals that you're trying to achieve? And if you're not reaching those goals, you shut the company down. So you don't carry on putting good money after bad. And about a month into my role at the VTF, I wrote out 7 goals. And then behind each goal I had a whole bunch of quantifiable metrics as to whether or not we'd met those goals. And I then passed that back into the machine. And what was really interesting is no one gave a toss. So this idea that we should, because I thought I should be measured, or the Vaccine Taskforce should be able to be measured at the end of my 6-month term to say, did we achieve what we were set out to achieve? And here were ways of how you'd measure it. Because some of it's easy, you know. Do you pick the right vaccines? Do the vaccines get approved? Do you scale up at the right population levels? Are you able to actually get them into arms? Things like that. But no one in government really was interested in the goals. They wanted it all to happen, but the idea of actually measuring and quantifying what you achieved is not something that was normal.
You mentioned, I think, in your book that maybe you will come to that later, but the culture of civil servants, it's not about outcomes that are measurable and then that people are held accountable for achieving those outcomes, but it's more like risk aversion, keep your job, don't make mistakes, don't take risks. I mean, and that was very counter-cultural to the civil servants. So.
Completely. So that's why it is slightly oil and water. When you bring private sector in, you basically, all we're focused on is, can we achieve what we want to achieve, lose as little money as possible, and just focus our money on those projects that are going to be successful. And the civil servants is all about, are you doing it in the right way? And will they be criticized for doing something in the wrong way? And so when I would say things like, well, I think we should do this, I would get pushback to say, well, we've got to think about the select committee afterwards. And the select committee is basically the mechanism in UK government where people are held to account to say, well, you spent this or you did this, why do you do it? And my view is, if we make a mistake, then you say, well, we made a mistake. And because we knew we were operating in an uncertain way, we didn't have the luxury of saying, well, we'll wait for all the data to come before we pick which vaccines. We had to make judgments based on incomplete data at a very early stage. And of course, we're going to make mistakes. Right. But that is not the culture of the civil service. And so that was the constant battle of we're pushing for outcomes and they are pushing for process. And all their incentives are about doing things in a correct way rather than doing the right thing. So the team was obviously important, and that's fundamental to any good venture capital business. Do you have people that have the skills and have the networks? Because in many cases, our companies are not going to be doing everything themselves. They're going to be reliant on partnering with other experts or other companies to do different parts of, to support them in different parts of their business. And it was exactly the same with vaccines. And we are a very collaborative industry. So the fact that in my phone, I didn't have the names of the Chinese companies and I didn't have the names of the Russian Sputnik, but I pretty much had the names and relationships with all the other companies. Even though I'm not a vaccine person, if I didn't know them directly, I knew somebody who did know them. And so we were able to basically just call up these companies and talk the same language. And that's something that government can't do because they don't have those skills. They don't know the industry. They don't know the players. And they don't know all the activities. So that worked incredibly well. And we got quick decisions. So one thing in government is often it goes from department to department to department, and it ends up at the Treasury who says no, and then it goes all around the houses again. So one condition I set was to insist that we had quick decision-making, which is what we had in that investment, what I think of as an investment committee, but a ministerial panel. And they were very good. So if we needed to meet on a Friday night, we met on a Friday night and they would read the materials and they asked good questions. So having that single decision-making was incredibly important. And as I talked about, tranching the money, so putting money in milestones against the achievement so that we knew that, you know, did the vaccines elicit an immune response? Could you scale them up to 200 litres? Could you scale them up to 1,000 litres? So we had clear goals of what the companies had to achieve before we gave them more money. And of course, we built a portfolio, which is what you always do in venture. So does that give you a flavor? I was going to stop there.
Yeah, oh, that's great.
Thank you.
When I read your story, the first question that came to my mind was, a personal one. This was life-changing for you. The impact you had, so many lives saved. The ability to deploy your talent, your network, your experience. That's such a critical moment. How did you experience that?
Yeah, so
at the personal level?
It wasn't actually as stressful as everyone thinks it was, because what we were doing was basically what we normally do in venture capital, which is to look at a bunch of different, basically, investment opportunities, and then do whatever you can do to make them successful. So if one company needed help with manufacturing, we brought our manufacturing team to go in and work with them night and day to try and help scale up. And we weren't nationalistic about it. So actually, when there was a Dutch plant that was manufacturing the AZ vaccine, and they weren't getting the yields, we sent a team to go and live in Holland to go and help share their skills so that they could get it scaled up. So it actually wasn't very stressful, is the answer, because I was in a cottage in the countryside looking at the hills and the views. And I think actually that helps. So I think being in green is soothing. And my husband was working very hard too. So he did I don't know what the equivalent was in Chile, but did the paycheck protection scheme, or what we call the furlough scheme. So basically protecting jobs in the UK. So I was spending...
I guess it's seguro de cesantía or something like that, like public money to support people who are losing jobs.
Correct.
During
so he spent £100 billion, and I spent 3.
Okay, so that made you feel good, right?
So it wasn't that stressful,
but it was positive in a way.
It was incredibly positive, because
so it
we
was
were
a great
making
opportunity.
Every day we learned something. We were able to do things, and we were able to move quickly, and everybody was collaborative. That was what was so amazing. And so I would speak to my equivalent, who was more than my equivalent, but in the States, every week, and he knew vaccines cold. So every week he'd say, well, I'm thinking about it like this. And I'd say, fantastic, taught me something. And then, for example, there was equipment that got stuck in America. And so I called him and said, can you help get this manufacturing equipment released, because it's holding up our scale up. And he said, well, send me a note, tell me what it is. And sure enough, the equipment was then shipped. So it was an incredibly positive time, actually. And of course, as time went on, we got more and more positive data by and large. So July was the first time, which was the Oxford vaccine, was able to show that they could mount an immune response. Well, we didn't know whether or not it was sufficient to protect, or sufficient to protect against disease and severe disease and death. But knowing that there was an immune response, incredibly good.
Reinforcing the whole effort.
Yeah, and then as the trials were getting recruited, Novavax was a US company that had virtually gone bankrupt before the pandemic. We then partnered with them, again, as a sort of more low-risk vaccine. And we were able to start and finish the pivotal clinical trials in the UK before America even started their trial. Now that sort of thing is great, because it's really feel good when you can do things. And we had no idea. This was going to be a clinical trial of 10,000, which is a big clinical trial that we had said we would recruit and enroll in 6 weeks. And after 2 weeks, the company came back to us and said, the recruitment process is going so well, could we increase to 15,000? And so we took a big gulp and said, yes. We had no idea whether or not we could do it. And they recruited 15,000. It was the single biggest vaccine trial the UK has ever run. And we still did it in 6 weeks. Now that sort of thing is incredibly positive. And so it actually wasn't everyone thinks, it must have been incredibly stressful, but it wasn't particularly stressful. But
it was very rewarding as well.
It was great.
Yeah.
And so the collaboration side of it and just seeing the progress was good. And of course there were bumps, a lot of bumps along the way, but it was good. And then exercise is really good. You know, if you just get out, if you're stuck at your desk indoors, that's not good.
Bog snorkeling.
Bog snorkeling. I didn't bog snorkel, but I would go for runs and bike rides and things like that. And that just keeps you normal.
Yeah. When I see you talk and I read your story, I think I spent a lot of time in government. And I think, I mean, it's so great, the way in which things were done during this experience. And I think this is a great story, but I'm sure many countries did things in a different way during COVID. But the COVID is not over, hopefully, but we're going to have more pandemics in the future. We have climate change. I mean, we're going to be facing other big challenges as well. But my sense is that you use at some point in the book, I think, the expression wartime kind of logic.
Yeah.
And we are back in peacetime, and it feels like everything is back to normal. And we are, again, doing things in the same old ways. And it was hard to kind of build, make sure that the lessons we learned are kind of changing the way in which we do things so that we're better prepared for the next one. But that doesn't seem to be working.
No. And I think you're exactly right. So certainly in the UK, it's gone right back to normal again. So I don't know what it's like in Chile, but in the UK, Whitehall, which is our sort of civil service, 90% are arts graduates, only 10% have science backgrounds. Now, that is bizarre in a technological society where so many decisions are going to have scientific drivers based on technology of whatever form. And rightly, the Vaccine Taskforce has been disbanded in the UK, but there is nobody with any authority or any expertise that has taken over. So that we have none of the industrial skills, none of the capabilities embedded or retained in government. And now, if you look at the UK versus, say, European Union, Europe got it wrong to begin with because they were too slow. They were trying to do procurement in the traditional way, which is to sort of line up all the vaccines, compare them, and then haggle on price. Whereas we were doing the opposite. We were saying, well, which is the most likely vaccine to get approved quickly that we think might work, and let's buy some. And don't worry about price. We did, of course, negotiate on price, but it wasn't our top priority. And now Europe has put in a very slick scheme which companies can work with. They know who to negotiate with, and there's a clear budget and there's a clear plan. And in the UK, we're back to normal again. It's not obvious. A new vaccine company wanting to work with the UK government won't know who to go to, and nor the government know who to send them to. It's really bad.
Yeah, frustrating.
Yeah.
I'm going to open it up for questions in a minute, but I have another question I want to ask. Another thing you mentioned is that, and I'm asking this because we're a business school, and we are convinced, otherwise we wouldn't be here, that the private sector has an essential role to play, to solve these type of problems. But another thing you mentioned is that the culture in civil servants is distrustful to be soft, of private enterprise.
Yeah.
And that logic of interaction, it's not a positive one. So
no, I would be stronger than that. I think by and large, our civil servants are pretty hostile to industry, so that they see businesses as always a sort of zero-sum game. So if they win, we lose, rather than actually, can we do something constructive together? So in the UK, and one of the people I brought onto my committee was the head of the Bioindustry Association. So basically the industry association that brings everybody together. So in February 2020, he brought together all the manufacturing companies in the UK and basically said, what can you do to help scale up these different vaccines? And we don't know which vaccines yet we need to scale up, but who's got the skills to basically grow up? These are biological, you're growing up cells, basically, to make vaccines. And over a weekend, 40 different companies put their hands up to say, well, we can provide the equipment, we can do this, we can do that. Now, this was self-assembled in February 2020, before the government had even an idea of what was going on. And so the reason why, in part, the AZ vaccine was quick to scale up in the UK was because they had been doing it for longer, because they had started doing it in February. But that was with no contracts, no money, no funding. It was basically the industry said, well, we're going to be asked to do it anyway, so we might as well get ahead of it. And they set aside their commercial work in order to do that. Now, the civil servants had no idea that this was going on. And they can't, I don't think now, they really still believe it. But the idea that industry is only out to feather their own nest and earn profits, you know, at the
expense of,
at the expense of other people is ridiculous. Now, of course, there are bad actors, and in the UK we had, you know, PPE procurement that was done very poorly, and that all sorts of people were given contracts who did not have the expertise to manufacture the equipment. And then that hit the press, and then that was all seen as a government failing because they didn't procure properly. And so their hostility in many ways to industry was reinforced by this, because they'd say, well, look, that company obviously was just out to make a quick buck. And yet in our case, it was the complete opposite. We had an incredibly supportive, productive industry. And of course, Whitehall in the UK, no one has ever worked in industry. So they don't have any idea. They've all been civil servants all their lives. And again, if I had a magic wand, I would make every single person work in industry for a period so they can actually see how it works, rather than having these views that everything is sort of nefarious and illicit.
Right. And I guess the dynamic in media and social media doesn't help.
No.
I mean, discriminate between, I mean, the
good players. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I think there was a couple of questions. Martin, you had one, or it was answered already?
Maybe do you have any view about China and what's going on now? I know it's not really your fault, but at the end of the day, the closing of the economy affects the rest of the world.
I think it's impossible for them to continue with a zero COVID policy. Again, China had a different vaccination policy. So most Western countries vaccinated in order of their most vulnerable, whereas China did the opposite. They vaccinated working age and just let the old and the vulnerable die. So it was a different vaccination strategy, but the whole inactivated virus vaccines, the way they're made in China, are not nearly as strong at protecting as the mRNA or the adeno, or the protein, actually. So I think what they're going to do is they're going to have to open up to other vaccine types. Now, BioNTech and Pfizer have agreed now with China that they can vaccinate the expats. So for me, it seems like it's a slight slippery slope, and at some point, it's going to open up.
But there was no dialogue between China and UK.
No, we did actually. So we talked to one of them, because as part, they were probably the world leaders in the whole inactivated vaccines, which actually we've got plenty of vaccines which are whole inactivated vaccines. So that was perfectly legitimate approach. But when we spoke to the MHRA, our regulator, they said there was no way they were going to be able to get approved quickly under the UK laws. So we dropped it. Also, although that wasn't a factor, I cannot imagine the UK giving the Chinese government unlimited indemnities.
Right.
We didn't get that far.
Unlimited, I mean,
I just think
that was too much. Okay, there's a question there. Please introduce yourself briefly and then ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Well, my name is Fernando Galdames. I work for Banchila as a manager, and I wanted to ask you, do you think for the next pandemic, will we be able to develop a vaccine so quickly? Or this was like a one-time success, or the technology achieved will allow us to continue to develop?
So there has been a concerted effort among the leading countries to develop a 100-day plan. So the idea should be that with good global surveillance, where you can get a sequence of the pathogen quickly, you should be able to scale up and evaluate, do the clinical testing within 100 days. Now, that's incredibly ambitious, but I think it is possible, certainly with mRNA, because it is very quick to design those vaccines. But equally, we can get ahead of it because we don't need to just wait for the next pandemic virus to come along. We can look at the coronavirus family, we can look at other pathogenic virus families, and we can start developing some templates, at least for those different viruses. And then when you know what the exact virus is, you can then drop in the sequences. So I would expect, I mean, we will have more pandemics, and I would expect it will be quicker. Whether we can really do 100 days, because that would not include the bulk manufacturing. But given that there's so much better capacity now than we had, I think it should be better. It definitely should be better. Whether or not we will still go through lockdowns, I imagine we may well go through lockdowns.
Great, thanks. There's another one in the back, and then
Hello. Yes. Thank you, Kate. I am Juan Pablo Mate. I have a company that's called Ciencia Pura, Pure Science. We create technology for the agriculture. Yeah. And yeah, I'm very impressed of what you achieved in so little time, and only happen if you have a relationship between the needs, the politician, and the business. I mean, it's impossible for separate. And now I would like to have your opinion in something a bit different but similar in what I'm more involved. For example, we are having the climate change, food security, and all these problems that we have in the future. And probably the best solutions for that are transgenics, new varieties. And it looks like nobody wants to spend in this kind of development because the government don't seem to like to approve this kind of technology. Well, we see people like to be vegan, vegetarian, organic, and there is no doubt this relationship that happened with the vaccine. I mean, probably we have the needs, we like the business, but we don't have the politician and regulation support. So probably in the future, in 10 more years, we'll have the same situation. We'll have no food, no land, and probably the government will say, "Hey, VC, can you put together and develop a new technology?" But what happened now?
So I think the key thing on that is to get a very clear goal that the government is, or any government is trying to achieve, because climate change is too big. But if you say, actually, we want to be able to make this product or grow it or manufacture it at this cost in 5 years' time, something where you can constrain and have that goal. And for that, we need to invest. That's the sort of thing that a government can get their heads around if they're willing to do so. Now, lots of these are not based on individual countries. So lots of these tools can be applied all around the world. So even if the Chilean government doesn't want to pick up a goal, maybe there's something that a different government would be willing to support. For me, it's all about getting the right goals agreed. And for vaccines, it was very easy because it was very clear. We want vaccines for the UK, vaccines for the world, which again, we didn't do a particularly good job. And then pandemic preparedness, we didn't do a very good job, but we did. So we, 1 out of 3.
Portfolio.
But I think that for me, it's all about the clarity of the goal of what you think you can deliver, and then persuading the funding agencies that is possible to do without it being heroic. Because again, with focus, lots of these things are soluble. It's just a matter of having funding and collaboration. I mean, I imagine you have to work with lots of companies to bring in different aspects of technology and equipment and knowledge and data.
Yeah, and I think there was a mind change in the on worldwide, because this mRNA vaccine never was clear to anyone to exactly. And one day to another say, okay, let's do it. So probably here is the same. Everyone worldwide want to be organic and be careful with the everything. But one day to another, they will say, okay, we need food and we will need to change our priority.
I agree.
Yeah. Hopefully we solve those problems before we have a full crisis, right? So Julio, and then,
yes.
Then another.
So Julio Rutor from Adolfo Ibáñez here. So my question is going back to your slides at the very beginning about the VC industry and in terms of what has changed in biotech and medical drug development after with this experience, in terms of you mentioned that the time it takes to close a fund, and now we've seen that you can come out with a vaccine in a couple of months, things that were never heard of. So the emergency approval processes. What influence do you see that is having on the way funds are being set up, they're being run, and investors are treating biotech investments?
Probably the biggest change is on the regulatory side, actually. So there was regulators are basically the groups you have to go through to get a drug approved, and historically, their whole role was basically as a policeman. So they would stop you from doing things, and they would only let you do things when everything, all your reports and your submissions were perfect, and only when they had approved it could you move forward. Now, in a pandemic, that's too slow. So they changed their approach to have what's called a rolling review, where you submit the data when you've got it, and it's incomplete. So they review bits at a time, and only by the end, when you've got your final pivotal phase 3 data, they've reviewed everything else. So then they can just look at that and say, right, yes, we're ready to go. And then it's very quick. So probably the biggest single change in our industry is the way that regulators work with companies. And the lady that runs MHRA talks about moving from being a policeman to being an air traffic controller. So working with these companies much, much earlier, and then helping them land the plane or get their drugs approved, rather than telling them, no, you can't do it until you've got, you know, this
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So that's, and I think that, I mean, again, regulators have gone back a bit to their old style as well, but that is probably the biggest single change, which is a greater collaborative approach, which is helpful. Yeah.
There is a question. I think we'll take 2 more, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you. I'm Gonzalo. I work also for the Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez. You were talking about regulators, and also you talked about collaboration with European companies and within the European continent. So I was wanting to ask you whether Brexit had any impact on this work, and how did it affect it, let's say, with regards to European regulations or the collaborations with companies and so on. So did it have any impact?
So in 2020, we were still part of Europe. So we were able to join the European procurement if we chose to. Now, I voted Remain, so I'm not part of the Brexit brigade. And so any European country could have done whatever they wanted to do. Hungary did, we did, but it was only because the European Commission, and this is where politics, because, you know, they're pretty cross with the Brits. They basically said, you can be part of our procurement because we're part of Europe, but they said you can't have a seat at the table. You have to stop all the work you've been doing on vaccines, including with AZ and Oxford, and we will tell you what vaccines you will get and when. So it was obviously not something that the government was going to sign up to. So I think the politics of it influenced it a bit, but the actual fact of setting up a vaccine task force, anybody could have done. And there was no reason that wasn't to do with Brexit. That was, I mean, we could have done both. We could have been part of Europe and we could have done our own thing. But the European Commission wasn't happy with that. So, and I think the regulator, that point actually probably was a bit related to Brexit. So it's a slightly technical point, but the European Medicines Agency was based in the UK. And the MHRA did a big majority of the medicines regulation based in for the European agency. So when the European EMA moved, the MHRA then had to decide what it was going to be, because how would you persuade, for example, big pharma companies to apply to EMA, to the FDA in the US, and why would they apply to the UK? Because, you know, it's a tiny market, we don't pay anything for drugs, you know. And so they had already started thinking about how could they make themselves attractive to pharma companies. And that was very influential on us, which is, well, how can we make ourselves attractive generally to vaccine companies? And so you do that by being helpful as opposed to punitive as a customer. So that sort of was Brexit related, but it was more strategic.
One final question here, and then, okay. I think Kate has to leave. Probably. So.
No, I delayed it to 10:30, okay, so I'm good.
Five more minutes, okay. We'll go to your question then. Next.
Hello, Kate. Well, I would like to go a little bit in the middle area.
Introduce yourself.
Sorry. My name is Benjamin. I work in a startup. It is environment related with cancer. It's a spin-off of the Universidad Católica. Yeah, there are three concepts that I would like to ask. First is how you select what you look at them, and then drivers and the fails in the last. Well, the first question is what you prefer, like personally, when you look at a startup, is it like a portfolio of PI, or is a validation of this product or potentially product? Yeah, go on.
Especially if it's a company we're going to create ourselves, or if it's very early. We have to be convinced that the underlying scientific insight is real. So lots of science doesn't replicate. So one of the first things we'll do is repeat the data to be convinced that whatever that particular knowledge is actually meaningfully causing a disease. So we're not interested by and large in symptomatic treatments. We want to know that if we block something or change something, that will have a causative effect on the disease. So the first thing is the science legitimate and robust and meaningful? Then the second thing is it druggable? Because the science may be fantastic, but if we can't work out how to develop a drug in a reasonable time frame, that again doesn't make it work, because, you know, we're an investor. So we need to basically have tractable data, which means you can develop a drug, you can develop a lead candidate, and you can start getting in vivo data, so data in some form of animal model, within a few years. I mean, if it takes 10 years, that's too long. If it takes 5 years, that's on the edge. But if you can get in vivo data in 3 years, that's probably okay. And then it depends, what is the cost of doing that? So if it takes $100 million to get in vivo data, that's going to be too much. If it's $10 million, we would do it. So we've got to balance the science with the tractability of what it is we're trying to achieve, and then with the team that's going to do it. So generally, pure academic researchers are not good entrepreneurs, and you want to leave them in the labs, pushing back the frontiers of science and doing all the clever thinking. And then what we do in drug discovery is quite boring. I mean, you're basically turning the handle to take it, and, you know, it works like this. Oh, well, it doesn't quite work, so you've got to put something else on it, and actually then you turn the handle again, and then you learn a little bit more. So it's a lot of this iterative development, which is not fun for academic brainy scientists.
Yeah.
And so management that's done it before and who've developed drugs are clearly the sorts of people that we want. You don't need lots of business people at the beginning. We've got to believe that there is a clinical need that this particular approach can address. And so we're not likely to go in, into a market that has a wide range of drugs already in it. But if you think about it, most diseases are not cured. So we've got a broad landscape.
And yeah, well, actually, I expect that answer. And because in science, it's very difficult to manage the data, or normally ask the people or VC in US, or I don't know, in UK, by the way, but they need to be a trustee person, or you need to be behind a trustee person. And how you review all the information that the startup, for example, if applying with your team or your board, you take deeper in the information, you understand all the information on you, or how is the process?
So we have a team that includes a lot of technical experts. So yes, we would do the first cut of review internally with our own team. And then something that we think is really interesting, we tend to bring together what we call a prepared mind workshop. So we will bring leading academics in the field with leading industry experts, and we put them in the room together, or a Zoom room together. And we then will go through to say, these are the areas of science we think are interesting, and these are how we're proposing to drug it. And we'd basically use it as a sort of live due diligence workshop session to really iterate. And it's very clear at the end of one of those, sometimes you just think, well, this is really cool science, but I have no idea how you ever can make any money out of it. Yeah. And other areas, actually, it's pretty clear that there is a path forward, and it may not be the path you thought it was when you went in, but it's bringing together that mix of the academic understanding plus industrial drug discovery. That is how we coalesce as to what is the plan we're willing to back. And then it comes down to Gantt charts and funding and milestones and doing all the things I said. So, funding to get to key value inflection points.
Okay.
I think we have a last question here.
Thank you. Hello.
So let's use the microphone.
Thank you because I have my 4 shots,
Good.
3 Pfizer and 1 Moderna. So, and
it's about 3 times the dose, though, so it's a strong dose.
It's a strong. I have a simple question, and I think an advice, because I like to know. My name is Paula, and I work as communication officer in Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, and I am very. I like the way your leadership in this whole process. So I would like to ask you, how can we transfer this kind of leadership to another business areas? What is your advice, or in another in entrepreneur initiatives?
I mean, I'm not sure. It's part leadership, but it's part structure. And I think there's lots of areas that you could apply this to. And it goes back to what are the government priorities? Because governments can do things because ultimately they're the big payer of all these things. And so whether it's food security or cyber security, or how do you accelerate, quantum computing? I think there are areas where if you can define the goals tightly, actually most things can be achieved. If the goals are too wide and too long-term and too wishy-washy, it's not going to work. But actually, if you can define things where you've got achievable goals within 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, I think it's eminently doable where you can bring in those experts with authority, empowered to go out and do things. So the UK talks the talk about it. And they have come up with lots of things that they want to replicate. In life sciences, we're looking, again, I'm not sure if it's going to make it in this government, but they've got key areas where there are some quantified goals. So for example, if you take cancer, most cancers are diagnosed too late. So by the time you go into a doctor with colorectal cancer or lung cancer, non-small cell lung, you're probably going to be stage 3 or stage 4. And it's much harder to treat when you've got metastatic cancer than if you caught it at stage 1. So the goal, for example, in cancer in the UK is how can you develop screening tools such you catch cancers much earlier stage so that you can then reduce the levels of mortality and the cost of treating those patients and improve quality of life. Now, things like that is a matter of just running a lot of different trials and testing systematically what are the different interventions you can do so that you can diagnose earlier. And for example, the UK set up a program called Our Future Health. So they're seeking 5 million people in the UK, again, diverse ethnic backgrounds and ages and everything else, where they will do full genetic sequencing with full physiological profiling and then monitor the individuals for years to figure out what, you know, if somebody ends up with congestive heart failure, what did we know if we go back 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, that could then help predict which people would get congestive heart failures versus which wouldn't. Now, those are the sorts of things that governments can do. It's big for industry, so it's not something that industry can do at all easily. But if the goal is to reduce chronic disease or to reduce the death rates from cancer, those are things that I think can be done well, combine industry with government. But it's all about agreeing the goals and what is achievable.
Well, I think that was a very smart, thorough answer, but I think it was humble. I think it was, your leadership was, I think it was a big part of this success. For me, it was a great honor to host this conversation. I think it was a great example of how the capabilities we try to teach our students at the business school can be deployed not only in business, for business problems, but to improve society as a whole. So thank you so much. Well, join me in
Thank you so much, Harry.
Thank you so much.
Brilliant.
Bye-bye to people who are watching. Ciao.